The wrapping paper still sat in neat piles by the fireplace when my mother told me to leave. Not asked. Told. Her voice carried that particular timbre of controlled fury that comes from years of managing a bank teller window, the kind that stays level even when the words cut deep. Your father and I think it's best if you go before everyone else arrives. The Christmas tree lights blinked their cheerful rhythm behind her, oblivious to the way the room had suddenly gone cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there holding the coffee mug I just refilled, the ceramic warming my palms while everything else in me went numb. The scent of cinnamon rolls my mother had baked at dawn still hung in the air, mixing with pine and the faint chemical smell of new electronics. Gifts I'd brought sat opened on the coffee table. The noise-canceling headphones for Dad. The cashmere scarf for Mom. The gift basket from that expensive place in Portland with the imported chocolates and the hand-poured candles. All of it now felt like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was attending. My father stood by the window overlooking Maple Ridge Drive, his pharmacist's posture rigid as always, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn around when he spoke. We raised you to be responsible, Natalie. To live within your means. This, he gestured vaguely at the gifts without looking at them, this is exactly the kind of behavior that got you into trouble in the first place. I hadn't been in trouble. I'd been building something. But that distinction had never landed with them, not in 6 years, not in 100 conversations that went nowhere. The rain tapped against the windows with that distinctive Oregon persistence, the kind that doesn't storm or rage but simply continues, wearing everything down slowly. Mom's expression held that specific blend of disappointment and embarrassment I'd learned to recognize as a child. Mrs. Chin from next door already commented on your car when you pulled up yesterday. A BMW, Natalie. Really? Her voice dropped to a harsh whisper even though we were alone. What are people supposed to think? That I can afford one, I said quietly. That maybe things are going better than you assume. Dad finally turned then, and his face carried the same look he'd worn when I'd told him I was leaving the pharmacy program at Oregon State. That mixture of disgust and vindication, like I'd just confirmed everything he'd suspected about my character. Going better? He laughed, sharp and cold. You show up here throwing money around like you've won the lottery, buying gifts that cost more than our mortgage payment, and you want us to believe you're doing well? We know what this is, Natalie. We've seen it before. Credit card debt. Living beyond your means. The same irresponsible pattern you've shown since you quit school. The accusation landed with the weight of years behind it. Every choice I'd made that diverged from their script had been catalogued, filed away as evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. Dropping out of pharmacy school. Taking those community college business courses they'd called a waste of time. Moving to Portland to work for a startup they'd never heard of. Staying in tech when they'd urged me to get a real job with benefits and a pension. Each decision had been another mark against me in a ledger I couldn't see but always felt. I should have defended myself. Should have told them the truth right then, standing in their living room with the Christmas tree lights painting everything in soft colors that didn't match the hardness of the moment. But I'd tried before. I'd tried explaining what I was building, what the company was becoming, how the industry worked. They nodded with the polite disinterest people show when someone describes a hobby they find baffling. My mother had once asked if I'd ever consider going back to school for something practical, maybe dental hygiene, they're always hiring. My father had sent me job listings for pharmacy technician positions, entry level, barely above minimum wage. So I stood there silent, holding a coffee mug in a house that had stopped feeling like home somewhere around my 23rd birthday, and I let them think what they'd already decided to think. The irony sat heavy in my chest. The debt they were so worried about me accumulating, the financial irresponsibility they were lecturing me about, all of it delivered in a house they'd nearly lost 3 weeks ago. A house that still stood, dry and warm with its cinnamon-scented kitchen and its blinking tree lights, because of money I'd wired through Marcus Vega's office on December 4th. But they didn't know that. They'd received a call from their mortgage company about a loan restructuring, some banking terminology that had apparently satisfied them enough not to ask questions. Or maybe they had asked questions and gotten answers that made sense to people who understood traditional finance but not the ways money could move quietly when you knew the right people and had the means to make things happen. Your Aunt Carol and Uncle Steve will be here at 2, my mother continued, her tone shifting into logistics mode, the same voice she'd used to coordinate my childhood schedule. Your cousins are bringing their kids. We'd rather not have to explain, she paused, searching for words, your situation in front of the whole family. My situation. As if I were recovering from something. As if success that didn't look like their definition of it was a condition to be managed, hidden away like an embarrassing relative or a medical diagnosis we didn't discuss in polite company. I set the coffee mug down on the side table, the small click of ceramic on wood somehow louder than it should have been. Okay, I said. I'll go. The relief on my mother's face was immediate and obvious. She moved toward me with that apologetic energy that didn't quite reach apology. We're not trying to be cruel, sweetheart. We just think it's best. Maybe after the holidays, we can sit down and talk about getting you some help. There are programs, financial counselors who specialize in young people who've gotten in over their heads. I nodded because arguing required energy I didn't have anymore. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks against the screen. Outside, the rain continued its patient work. I gathered my coat from the closet by the front door, the same closet where I'd hung it as a kid coming home from school, back when disappointing them was something I still feared enough to avoid. Before you go, my father said, his voice softer now but no less certain, I want you to know we love you. This is because we love you. We can't watch you self-destruct without saying something. Self-destruct. The words sat in the room like smoke. I thought about the contract signed. The revenue projections exceeded. The team I'd built, 23 people who trusted my vision enough to bet their careers on it. The acquisition offer we'd accepted in October, the one that had made the business section of the Pacific Northwest Journal, complete with my photo and an interview about women in tech leadership. My parents didn't read the business section. They read the pharmacy trade publications and the local Riverside Gazette. The world where I'd built something significant existed in a parallel universe they'd never thought to visit. I love you too, I said, because it was true even when everything else felt broken. The drive back to Portland took longer than usual. Christmas morning traffic was light, but I drove slowly, letting the windshield wipers maintain their steady rhythm while my mind tried to process what had just happened. The highway stretched out gray and wet, the Willamette Valley spread out on either side, dormant and waiting for spring. My phone sat silent in the cup holder. Rachel was in Boston with her graduate program, 3 hours ahead and probably still asleep. Victor Chen, my business partner, was in Hawaii with his family. Marcus Vega didn't work on Christmas. I was alone with this, at least for now. The BMW my mother had found so ostentatious handled the wet roads with the confidence that came from German engineering and the kind of research I'd done before buying it. Not flashy by tech industry standards where Teslas and Porsches filled company parking lots, but luxurious enough that I'd allowed myself the pleasure of it. A reward for years of sleeping on Rachel's couch, of eating ramen, of stretching every dollar until it screamed. Of building something from nothing while everyone who was supposed to believe in me most offered concern disguised as care. My apartment in Portland's Pearl District was quiet and temperature controlled, the smart home system I'd installed keeping everything at exactly 70 degrees. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, the rain creating patterns on the glass that caught the gray morning light. I'd bought the place in August, paid in full, no mortgage. My parents thought I rented. I'd never corrected them. What would have been the point? They'd have found a way to make it another sign of my recklessness. Buying instead of renting in this market. Didn't I know about property taxes? Maintenance costs? The bubble that was surely about to burst? I made tea, English breakfast, and stood at the window watching the city wake up slowly into Christmas. Lights in other apartments. The occasional car on the street below. Somewhere out there, families were doing the normal things. Opening gifts, cooking elaborate meals, arguing about politics and dietary restrictions, all the ordinary dysfunction that still felt like belonging. I'd traded that for this pristine space with its modern furniture and its carefully curated art, This life I'd built that no one in my family understood or valued. The tea grew cold in my hands as I stood there. Hours passed in that peculiar way they do when you're avoiding thought by letting your mind go deliberately blank. My phone buzzed occasionally. Holiday messages from colleagues. A text from Rachel asking how Christmas was going, the question innocent because I hadn't told her about the morning. A group message from the Streamline IQ team, photos of their various celebrations, the casual intimacy of people who'd fought battles together and come out victorious. The relationship with my parents had fractured slowly, not in one dramatic break but in 1,000 small disappointments accumulating like sediment. It started, I suppose, when I was 17 and announced I wanted to study business instead of following my father into pharmacy. The conversation had happened in the kitchen of the Maple Ridge house, late summer light coming through the windows while my mother made dinner and my father read the paper at the table. Pharmacy is stable, he'd said without looking up. It's respected. You'll always have work, always have security. Business is vague. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What does that even mean? You want to sell things? Manage people? It's not a profession, Natalie. It's not something you build a life on. But I had watched him come home exhausted night after night from the Riverside pharmacy, stressed about insurance companies and drug costs and corporate policies handed down from headquarters in some distant city. I'd watched the job that was supposed to provide security slowly drain something essential from him, leaving behind a man who measured success by not failing rather than by actually achieving anything. That wasn't stability. That was slow surrender. I'd compromised initially. Enrolled at Oregon State in their pre-pharmacy program, thinking maybe I could find a way to merge what they wanted with what I wanted. Spent 2 years taking organic chemistry and biology and pharmacology, maintaining the grades, checking the boxes. But the whole time, I'd been auditing business courses on the side. Reading case studies about startups and venture capital. Following tech blogs and industry news with the hunger of someone who'd found their actual language. The breaking point came during spring term of my sophomore year. A professor in one of those audit courses mentioned a startup accelerator program in Portland, a 12-week intensive for early-stage companies. Applications were open. I'd been working on an idea, just sketches and notes really, about workflow automation for small businesses. Nothing revolutionary, but I'd noticed a gap in the market, a space where existing solutions were either too complex or too expensive for companies with fewer than 50 employees. I applied without telling anyone. Got accepted. And then I had to go home for spring break and explain that I was leaving Oregon State, leaving the pharmacy track, leaving the entire plan my parents had spent 18 years building in their minds. My father had been silent for a full minute after I told them. My mother had started crying, not dramatic sobs but quiet tears that were somehow worse. "You're throwing away your future," she'd said. "For what? Some program that probably won't lead to anything? Do you know how many businesses fail, Natalie? Do you have any idea?" I knew the statistics. 90% of startups fail. Most don't make it past 5 years. The odds were terrible, the path uncertain, the whole endeavor an exercise in optimized risk-taking. But I also knew that I was 20 years old and if I didn't try now, I'd end up 40 and bitter, standing behind a pharmacy counter wondering what might have been. They'd stopped paying for school after that. Not as punishment exactly, but as a logical consequence. If I was going to make adult decisions against their advice, I could fund those decisions with adult money. Fair enough. I moved into Rachel's apartment in Portland, slept on her couch for 2 years, worked 3 part-time jobs while attending the accelerator program and then taking community college business courses to fill in the gaps in my knowledge. The early days of Streamline IQ were built on sleep deprivation and optimism bordering on delusion. Just me and Victor Chin, who I'd met during the accelerator program, working out of a co-working space in Beaverton that smelled like old coffee and ambition. We'd cold-called potential customers, refined the software based on feedback, pivoted twice when our initial assumptions proved wrong. Celebrated our first paying customer with dollar tacos and the cheapest beer the convenience store sold. Built our minimum viable product with code that was probably held together with prayer and stubbornness more than elegant engineering. My parents came to Portland once during that period, ostensibly to take me to dinner but really to stage an intervention. The restaurant was nice, nicer than we could normally afford, which should have been my first clue. They'd ordered wine and made small talk before my father launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. "We've been thinking about your situation. We know you're struggling. There's no shame in admitting a mistake. The pharmacy program would still take you back. You could finish your degree, get licensed, have a real career." I'd tried explaining what we were building. Showed them our user numbers, our revenue projections, the small but growing interest from potential investors. My mother had nodded with the expression of someone humoring a child's fantasy. My father had asked practical questions that revealed he fundamentally didn't understand how venture-backed companies worked, how growth could be valuable even when profitability was still quarters away, how the right partnerships could change everything overnight. "That's not a business model," he'd said finally. "That's a gamble. You're gambling with your 20s, with the years when you should be establishing yourself. What happens when this doesn't work out? What's your backup plan?" I didn't have a backup plan. Backup plans were for people who expected to fail. But I couldn't say that without sounding naive, so I just said we were being smart about it, managing our burn rate, making data-driven decisions. Corporate speak that bounced off them like rain off a windshield. The distance grew from there. Visits became shorter and less frequent. Phone calls stayed surface level. They asked about my health, the weather, whether I was eating vegetables. Never about the company. Never about what I was actually doing with my days. It was like I'd stepped off the edge of their map into territory they'd decided wasn't worth exploring. I was there but not there, their daughter in biology but not in the ways that seemed to count. Rachel had understood. She was getting her PhD in economics at Boston University, studying entrepreneurship and innovation, and she got why I couldn't walk away even when the easier path beckoned. We'd talk on the phone for hours, her offering frameworks from her research, me describing the practical chaos of trying to scale a product while managing a team and keeping investors confident. She never questioned whether I should be doing it. Only how to do it better. Victor understood too, but differently. He'd come from money, parents who'd funded his previous startup and barely blinked when it failed. For him, risk was subsidized, failure padded. He brought technical brilliance and funding connections. I brought hunger and a refusal to accept that the statistics had to apply to us. We made a strange team but an effective one, our different backgrounds creating a kind of balanced perspective that served the company well. The breakthrough came in year 3. A mid-sized regional bank tested our software for their small business clients and saw immediate results. Efficiency up, errors down, customer satisfaction improved. They signed a contract, then referred us to 3 other banks. Suddenly we weren't a scrappy startup begging for attention. We were a company with traction, with proof points, with a story that made sense to investors who'd been hesitant before. The funding round that followed let us hire real engineers, real salespeople, real operations staff. Move into an actual office instead of the co-working space. Pay ourselves salaries that didn't require side jobs. I bought my first car that wasn't held together by duct tape and hope. Nothing fancy, just a reliable Honda that started every morning without negotiation. Started eating at restaurants where the menu didn't have pictures. Small markers of not failing that felt enormous after years of financial tightrope walking. I'd called my parents after we closed the funding round, excited to finally have news they might understand. "We raised $2 million, I'd said. Real investors believe in what we're building. This is happening, Dad. This is actually happening." There'd been a pause. "That's nice, honey. Just remember that investment money isn't real money. It's debt, essentially. You'll have to pay that back somehow. Make sure you're not getting in over your head." He hadn't understood that venture capital didn't work like a bank loan. Hadn't wanted to understand, maybe. The conversation had deflated me in ways that previous dismissals hadn't, because this time I'd had proof and it still hadn't mattered. Years 4 and 5 were growth. Not smooth, never smooth, but trending upward in ways that made the early chaos feel worth it. We expanded to serve healthcare systems, manufacturing companies, and legal firms. Hired a proper leadership team. Established processes that meant Victor and I weren't personally fixing every problem at 3 in the morning. Started appearing on regional business lists and industry roundups. Nothing flashy, but solid, real, undeniable. My parents remained unconvinced or uninterested, the distinction unclear. When I mentioned awards or recognition, they changed the subject. When I described partnerships with major corporations, they asked if I was getting enough sleep. The message was clear. This thing I was doing, this thing consuming my 20s and defining my identity, didn't register as legitimate in their framework. It was still that phase I was going through, that detour from the sensible life they'd planned, that source of concern requiring patience until I came to my senses. The acquisition offer came in October. A larger tech company had been watching our growth and wanted to integrate our platform into their enterprise solution suite. The terms were favorable, more than favorable, the kind of exit that venture capitalists dream about and founders rarely achieve on their first company. Victor and I had spent weeks in conference rooms with lawyers and bankers, negotiating details and structures, making sure our team was protected and our product would continue serving the customers who'd trusted us. We'd signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon. Walked out of the office into Portland drizzle feeling like we'd just crossed some finish line we'd been sprinting toward for 6 years. The Pacific Northwest Business Journal ran the story the following week, complete with photos and interviews about what came next. I was 29 years old and had just successfully exited a tech startup, something statistically improbable enough to be newsworthy in regional business circles. I'd thought about sending the article to my parents. Had even drafted an email with the link, something casual about finally having concrete proof that the gamble had paid off. But I'd never sent it. They didn't read business news. They wouldn't have understood the significance. And some part of me, the part that had been disappointed too many times, didn't want to hand them another opportunity to diminish something I was proud of. So I'd kept it to myself, added it to the growing collection of achievements they'd never celebrated because they'd never known to celebrate them. The money from the acquisition hit my accounts in November, transforming from abstract numbers in a term sheet to actual liquid wealth that required decisions. I'd paid off Rachel's student loans as a surprise. Set up trust funds for Victor's kids. Made donations to the community college that had educated me when universities felt out of reach. Invested the bulk of it with advisors who specialized in sudden wealth management, the kind of problem I'd never imagined having back when I was splitting dollar tacos and calling it dinner. And then I'd done something probably stupid, definitely emotional. I'd paid off my parents' debt. Not directly, that would have required explanations I wasn't ready to have. But through Marcus Vega, who specialized in quiet solutions to complicated problems. He'd structured it as a loan modification through their mortgage company, paperwork that looked official and boring enough that they'd signed it without suspecting their daughter had just made their financial crisis disappear. $31,000. A number that would have buried me 5 years ago, that would have required years of pharmacy wages to accumulate. Now it was a wire transfer, a signature, a problem solved before breakfast. I'd done it not because they'd asked, they'd never have asked me because they didn't know I could help, but because they were my parents and somewhere under the disappointment and the distance, love still did its complicated work. They'd called to tell me about the loan modification, excited in their cautious way about this unexpected piece of good fortune. Some banking error or program we qualified for, my mother had said. Saved us from having to sell the house, can you imagine? Your father was so stressed. I'd made appropriate surprised noises and said I was happy for them, and we'd talked about whether I was coming home for Christmas, and the whole conversation had felt like performance art, both of us playing roles we'd perfected through years of careful practice. Now it was Christmas Day and I was standing in my apartment watching rain streak the windows while my parents thought I was a financial disaster kept at bay only by their tough love. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt quite so much. I'd saved their house and they'd thrown me out of it, all because the success I'd achieved didn't wear the costume they recognized. The day after Christmas arrived with the same gray persistence as the day before. I woke early, body clock still calibrated to years of startup hours when sleep was something you caught between crisis management sessions. The apartment felt too quiet, too perfect, like a showroom nobody actually lived in. I made coffee and stood at the window watching the city shake off its holiday stupor, delivery trucks already moving through streets, the world returning to its regular rhythms with the efficient indifference of a machine clicking back into gear. My phone showed 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. No voicemail. Then a text at 7:30 from Marcus Vega asking if I was available for a call. Unusual for him to reach out on the day after Christmas, unusual enough that I felt something tighten in my chest. Marcus didn't bill hours on holidays unless something required immediate attention. I called him back. He answered on the second ring with the calm directness that made him good at his job. "Natalie, thanks for getting back to me. I need to give you a heads up about something. Your parents called my office yesterday afternoon. They somehow got my contact information and wanted to know about the loan modification on their mortgage." The coffee in my hands suddenly felt too hot. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing specific. Attorney-client privilege covers you, not them." But they were persistent. "Your father in particular seemed convinced there was more to the story than the paperwork indicated. He mentioned something about unusual timing, about how the terms seemed too favorable to be a standard bank program. I told them I couldn't discuss client matters and ended the call, but I wanted you to know they're asking questions." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Of course they were asking questions. My father had spent 30 years working in a pharmacy where every transaction had clear documentation, where anomalies meant errors or fraud. He would have looked at that loan modification the way he looked at prescriptions that didn't quite match the patient's history. With suspicion and the determination to find the underlying truth. "Do you think they've figured it out?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, the pause of someone choosing words carefully. "I think your father is smart enough to know that sudden good fortune usually has a source. Whether he's connected it specifically to you, I can't say. But he's looking. If I were you, I'd expect a conversation soon." The conversation came faster than expected. My mother called at 9, her voice carrying that tight control that meant she was upset but determined not to show it. "We need to talk. Can you come to the house this morning?" I could have said no. Could have insisted on meeting somewhere neutral, a coffee shop where we'd have to maintain public civility. But something in her tone suggested this was already past the point where location would matter. "I'll be there by 11. The drive to Riverside felt longer than usual, each mile marker a countdown to something I'd been avoiding for 6 years. The rain had paused, leaving everything slick and reflective. The Willamette Valley stretched out in shades of gray and brown under clouds that promised more weather coming. I rehearsed conversations in my head, different versions of explanations and defenses, but none of them felt adequate to the moment building ahead. The house on Maple Ridge Drive looked exactly as it had the day before, modest and well-maintained, the kind of place that represented stability without ostentation. My father's sedan sat in the driveway next to my mother's practical crossover. Both vehicles were at least 8 years old, driven until they required replacement rather than upgraded for pleasure. Thrift as virtue, waste as sin. The values I'd been raised with and then complicated by building something that required burning money to make money, that demanded calculated risk over careful conservation. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deliberately. The BMW suddenly felt like a provocation, too nice for this neighborhood, too obvious a marker of the distance between my life and theirs. I considered the optics of walking up their driveway in a car that cost more than they made in a year and felt the familiar shame that came with success they didn't approve of. Then I remembered being kicked out yesterday and felt the shame transform into something harder. My father opened the door before I could knock. He looked older in the flat morning light, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered, his hair grayer at the temples. For a moment neither of us spoke, just stood there in the awkward geography of threshold and entry, the physical space mirroring the emotional distance we'd been navigating for years. "Come in," he said finally, stepping back. "Your mother's in the kitchen." The house smelled like coffee and something baking, comfort scents that didn't match the tension in the air. I followed him through the living room where yesterday's gift still sat on the coffee table, the detritus of a holiday interrupted. My mother stood at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug, her posture rigid with the effort of maintaining composure. Sit down, she said, gesturing to the table. Please. I sat. They remained standing, which gave them the psychological advantage of height but also revealed how uncomfortable they were with whatever conversation was coming. My father pulled out his phone, scrolled to something, then set it on the table facing me. The screen showed the Pacific Northwest Business Journal article from November, my photo next to the headline about Streamline IQ's acquisition. Mrs. Chen brought this over this morning, he said. She saw it when it first came out but didn't mention it because she assumed we already knew. Assumed we were proud and just being modest about our daughter's success. His voice carried a particular quality I'd never heard before, something between hurt and fury that made each word land with careful precision. She asked how we were celebrating. Asked if we'd been surprised by the amount. Asked questions that made it very clear she knew something we apparently didn't. I looked at the photo on the screen. It was from the interview, me in the conference room at our office, professional but relaxed, the caption identifying me as co-founder and CEO. The article detailed the acquisition terms, the company's growth trajectory, the innovative approach to workflow automation that had attracted buyer interest. Everything laid out in the dry language of business journalism that somehow made it sound more legitimate than it ever felt while we were building it. My mother set her mug down with enough force that coffee sloshed over the rim. You sold a company. You sold a company for enough money that it made the news, and you didn't think to mention this to us? I didn't think you'd care, I said quietly. You've never cared about what I was building. That's not fair, my father cut in. We've always cared about you. About your well-being, your future. You've cared about the version of me that matched your plan. The version studying pharmacy, following your path, making choices you understood. The actual me, the one sitting in front of you, you've spent 6 years treating like a problem to be managed or a phase to wait out. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was tired of soft-pedaling truth to protect feelings that hadn't protected mine. My mother's face flushed, mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. My father just stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The loan modification, he said finally. The $31,000 that saved our house. That was you. It wasn't a question but I answered anyway. Yes. Why? His voice cracked slightly on the word, confusion bleeding through the anger. Why would you pay off our debt and not tell us? Why would you let us think it was some banking program when you could have just offered to help? Because you would have said no. Because you think I'm financially irresponsible and drowning in credit card debt. Because telling you I had money would have required explaining where it came from, and you've made it clear for 6 years that you don't want to hear about my actual life. So I did it quietly, the way I've done everything, and I let you keep believing whatever made you comfortable. The silence that followed felt like something physical, a weight pressing down on all of us. Outside, a car passed on Maple Ridge Drive, the sound of its tires on wet pavement distant and ordinary. The refrigerator hummed. The clock over the stove ticked its patient rhythm. Normal sounds in a moment that felt anything but. My mother pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't understand. If you had this kind of money, if you'd achieved this kind of success, why hide it? Why not share it with us? Why let us worry about you? Because your worry wasn't about me, I said. It was about your idea of me. You worried I was failing because you'd decided I was going to fail. Nothing I said could convince you otherwise. So yes, I stopped trying to convince you. I built my life, and I let you keep your assumptions, and I figured we'd all just exist in our separate realities until something forced them to intersect. And yesterday? My father's voice was quiet now, the anger drained out into something that sounded like grief. Yesterday we kicked you out because we thought you were being reckless with money you didn't have. Yesterday you kicked me out because I didn't perform poverty the way you expected. Because I bought nice gifts and drove a nice car and didn't present as struggling. You saw success that didn't match your narrative and decided it must be debt. You didn't ask. You assumed. Just like you've assumed for 6 years that I was wasting my 20s on a fantasy that would inevitably collapse. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother wiping away. I was so sure you were going to fail. The statistics, all those articles about startups and how most people lose everything. I just wanted you safe, wanted you to have what your father has. Security, stability, a clear path forward. Dad has been miserable for 20 years, I said, not trying to be cruel but needing her to hear it. He hates his job. Hates the corporate policies and the insurance nightmares and the feeling of being a cog in a machine he doesn't control. That's what you wanted for me? That's security? My father flinched but didn't argue. We sat there, three people who shared DNA and history but had somehow become strangers to each other, the kitchen table between us like a border we'd been unable to cross. I could see him processing, recalibrating, trying to fit this new information into frameworks that no longer held. Tell us about it, he said finally. Not the business terms, not the acquisition. Just tell us what the last 6 years have actually been like. So I did. Not a sales pitch or a justification, just the truth. I told them about sleeping on Rachel's couch and working 3 jobs while building the initial product. About the first customer who took a chance on unknown software from unknown founders. About the night our server crashed during a critical demo and Victor and I stayed up until dawn rebuilding everything while eating cold pizza and questioning our life choices. About hiring our first employee and feeling the weight of being responsible for someone else's livelihood. About the funding rounds where we pitched to investors who sometimes saw potential and sometimes saw kids playing startup. I told them about the wins and the failures, the partnerships that opened doors and the deals that fell through despite months of work. About learning to manage people and budgets and expectations, about the peculiar challenge of scaling something from 2 people in a co-working space to 23 people with salaries and benefits and career aspirations tied to decisions I helped make. About the satisfaction of solving problems for customers who sent thank you notes and renewal contracts. About the exhaustion that came with building something from nothing and the specific joy of watching it actually work. My mother listened with an intensity one hadn't seen from her before, actually listening instead of waiting to respond with concerns or corrections. My father's expression shifted as I talked, defensive walls lowering incrementally until he just looked like a man hearing his daughter's life for the first time and realizing how much he'd missed. When I finished, the kitchen had different air in it. Not resolved, not magically healed, but changed in some fundamental way. My father rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of someone trying to physically reset their thinking. I owe you an apology, he said. Multiple apologies. For not listening. For not trying to understand. For letting my fear for you turn into judgment of you. I owe you one too, my mother added. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting my idea of what your life should look like. That wasn't fair. You deserved parents who believed in you even when they didn't understand what you were doing. The apologies landed softer than I expected, without the defensiveness or qualifications I'd braced for. They weren't enough to erase 6 years of dismissal, but they were a start, a foundation we could maybe build something on if we were all willing to do the work. I should have told you, I said. Should have insisted you listen instead of just accepting that you wouldn't. I got so used to you not seeing me that I stopped trying to be seen. That wasn't fair either. You can't know what I don't show you. We sat with that for a while, the honesty creating space that hadn't existed before. My father got up and poured more coffee, the domestic gesture feeling like a peace offering. My mother pulled out her phone and started reading the article properly, occasionally asking questions about terms or concepts she didn't understand. I answered them, and it felt strange and good to talk about my work with my parents like it was real, like it mattered, like it was worth their attention. Mrs. Chen is going to have questions, my mother said eventually, a small smile playing at her lips. She's probably already told half the neighborhood. Our daughter the tech executive. I'm not going to know how to talk about this. Just tell them I built a company and got lucky, I said. That's basically true. It's not luck if you worked yourself half to death for 6 years, my father countered. That's earned. There's a difference. The acknowledgement caught me off guard, hit me somewhere deeper than the apologies had. Earned. He thought I'd earned it. The man who'd spent my entire life believing in effort and discipline and the direct correlation between work and reward was finally applying that framework to my choices. It shouldn't have mattered so much. I'd already proven myself to the people whose opinions counted in my industry. But somehow hearing it from him, seeing him revise his assessment based on new information, that mattered in ways I hadn't expected. We talked for another hour, filling in gaps and revising histories. They asked about Victor and the team, about what happened to the company post-acquisition, about what I was planning to do next. I asked about their lives, actually curious in a way I hadn't been when I'd been defending myself against their worry. We were tentative with each other, careful, like people learning a language they'd thought they spoke but discovering they'd only known a dialect. Before I left, my father walked me to the door. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the house's interior light, looking uncertain in a way that made him seem more human and less like the authority figure he'd always been to me. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I should have said it yesterday. Should have said it 6 years ago when you first told us what you wanted to do. I'm saying it now. I'm proud of you, Natalie. Not for the money or the recognition, but for having the courage to build something when I was too scared to do anything but criticize." I hugged him then, awkward and brief but real. Drove back to Portland with the radio off, just the sound of tires on highway and the quiet realization that the distance between us hadn't disappeared but had at least been measured, mapped, made navigable. The weeks that followed had a different texture. My parents called more often, asking questions instead of offering advice. They read the business section now, sent me articles about tech trends and startup culture, sometimes with notes saying they didn't understand half of it but wanted to learn. My mother admitted to her book club that her daughter had sold a company, said it with the careful pride of someone testing out new vocabulary. My father told colleagues at the pharmacy that I'd done well for myself in tech, deflecting details he still didn't fully grasp but clearly wanting to claim the achievement as somehow connected to his lineage. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. We still had habits of distance to unlearn, patterns of communication that defaulted to surface pleasantries instead of depth. But it was progress, movement in the right direction, the slow work of rebuilding trust that had been damaged by years of mutual disappointment. Rachel called from Boston when I told her the whole story, laughing at the absurdity of it while also acknowledging the pain underneath. "Your parents kicked you out of their house on Christmas after you secretly paid off their mortgage. That's like a Dickens novel if Dickens understood venture capital." "It would be funny if it hadn't hurt so much," I said. "It can be both. Most important things are." She was right, as usual. The story could be multiple things at once. Absurd and painful. Frustrating and ultimately healing. A reminder that people who love each other can still fail each other spectacularly and sometimes find their way back if they're willing to admit the failure and do better. Victor thought the whole thing was proof that family dynamics were more complex than any business problem we'd solved. "At least with business," he said, "everyone's incentives are relatively aligned. With family, you're trying to solve for variables that aren't even on the same axis. Success and love and expectations and identity all tangled together with no clear metrics." He wasn't wrong. The metrics for a successful family relationship were nothing like the metrics for a successful company. No quarterly reviews, no key performance indicators, no clear benchmarks for growth or improvement. Just people trying to see each other clearly and mostly failing but occasionally succeeding enough to keep trying. I started having dinner with my parents once a month, driving to Riverside on Sunday evenings when the highway was quiet. We'd eat my mother's cooking and talk about things that mattered and things that didn't, slowly building a database of knowledge about each other's actual lives. They met Victor, who charmed them with stories about early streamline IQ chaos and made the tech world seem less foreign. They asked thoughtful questions about what I was working on next, about whether I'd start another company or take time to figure out what came after achieving the goal that had driven my entire 20s. I didn't have answers yet. The acquisition had created space in my life I wasn't sure how to fill. For 6 years, every decision had been filtered through the question of what was best for the company. Now the company belonged to someone else and I belonged only to myself, and that freedom felt both liberating and slightly terrifying. My father told me once during one of those dinners that he envied the choice I had. Not the money, though he admitted that was nice, but the ability to decide what came next based on what I wanted rather than what was necessary. "I spent 30 years in a job I took because it was secure," he said. Never asked myself if it was what I actually wanted to do with my life. By the time I thought to ask, I had a mortgage and a family and retirement contributions, and security had become its own kind of prison. You could still do something different, I pointed out. You're 58, not 80. That's potentially another decade of work if you want it. Maybe work that doesn't make you miserable. He considered that, turning it over like an object he was examining from new angles. Maybe, he said finally. Or maybe I've made my peace with the choices I made. But I'm glad you didn't make the same ones. Glad you had the guts I didn't. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, sitting at their kitchen table with dinner dishes still on the counter and evening light fading outside. My mother had been quiet through most of it, but when my father finished, she reached over and squeezed my hand. You saved our house, she said softly. Not just financially. You saved it by refusing to let us push you away permanently. Thank you for that. I squeezed back, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. The gratitude felt disproportionate to what I'd actually done, but I understood what she meant. I'd kept the door open even when they'd been closing it. Kept showing up even when showing up hurt. Kept offering connection even when connection was rejected. That persistence had created the possibility of this moment, sitting in their kitchen and actually being seen. The story could have ended there, with reconciliation achieved and lessons learned. But life rarely packages itself that neatly. The work of maintaining relationship across difference continued, sometimes easy and sometimes hard, always requiring intention and willingness to navigate discomfort. We disappointed each other in smaller ways, miscommunicated, and had to clarify, brought our separate contexts to conversations and had to explain what seemed obvious from our perspectives but opaque from others. But we kept at it. Kept choosing connection over comfort, honesty over politeness, the messy reality of knowing each other over the cleaner fiction of assumptions. It wasn't the relationship I'd wanted as a kid, when I'd imagined parents who would champion every dream and celebrate every achievement without reservation. But it was the relationship we could actually build, the one that acknowledged our differences and failures while still maintaining fundamental care. Some stories are about dramatic reversals, about the moment when everything changes and wrongs are righted and people finally see what they should have seen all along. This was partly that story. The moment when my parents recognized their blindness and I recognized my complicity in staying invisible. The satisfying pivot of understanding replacing assumption. But mostly it was a story about the slower work that comes after the pivot. About building bridges across chasms that took years to form. About learning that you can love people who don't understand you and be loved by people you don't fully understand, and that's not a failure of love but maybe its truest form. The choice to care despite difference, to keep showing up despite disappointment, to revise and try again when the first version doesn't work. The spring after that Christmas brought changes nobody had anticipated. My father called on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying an unusual energy that made me sit up straighter in my desk chair. I've been thinking about what you said. About it not being too late to do something different. I talked to the regional manager today. Gave my notice. I'm retiring at the end of June. The statement hung in the air for a moment while I processed it. You're leaving the pharmacy? After 30 years? 32 actually. Started right out of school. He laughed, a sound with more lightness in it than I'd heard from him in years. Your mother thinks I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. But I keep thinking about you at 20, walking away from the safe path because you knew it wasn't your path. Figured if you could do it with nothing, I could do it with a pension and savings. What are you going to do instead? I asked, genuinely curious. That's the terrifying part. I have no idea. Maybe travel. Maybe volunteer. Maybe just sit on the porch and read books I've been too tired to focus on for decades. The not knowing feels dangerous and exciting in equal measure. Is that how it felt for you when you started the company? Every single day for the first 3 years. Still feels like that sometimes, even now. We talked for another hour, him asking questions about how to navigate uncertainty, me realizing that for the first time in our relationship, he was coming to me for guidance. Not about business specifically, but about the emotional architecture of walking away from security towards something undefined. The role reversal felt strange and right, a rebalancing of authority that had been overdue. My mother called the next day with her own news, delivered with the slightly defensive tone of someone expecting pushback. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center. It starts next week. Before I could respond, she continued. I know it's silly. I'm 56 years old and I've never painted anything in my life. But I've been thinking about what you said about my poems, about the things I used to enjoy before everything became about maintaining and managing. I want to try creating something again. That's not silly at all. That's brave. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know if it's brave or just overdue. I spent so many years worried about security and appearances and doing everything the right way that I forgot to ask what would make me happy. Watching you build something from nothing, it reminded me that creating things is possible. Not just enduring things. The conversations marked a shift in our family dynamic that continued to unfold through that spring and into summer. My parents were rediscovering agency they'd set aside, asking questions about their own lives they'd been too busy or too scared to ask before. I found myself in the unfamiliar position of encouraging them, offering perspective from the other side of risk-taking, modeling a version of life that prioritized meaning over stability. My father's retirement party at the pharmacy was small and awkward, the kind of corporate event that tries to manufacture emotion through sheet cake and brief speeches. I went to support him, stood in the break room with its fluorescent lights and motivational posters, and watched colleagues who'd worked alongside him for decades offer generic well-wishes and countdown to retirement jokes. He smiled and accepted their cards and thanked them for their years together, but I could see the relief underneath. He was escaping something that had stopped nourishing him long ago. Afterward, we went to dinner at a place he chose, not fancy but comfortable, the kind of restaurant that had been there forever and would probably be there forevermore. He ordered a beer, unusual for him, and sat back in the booth with an exhale that seemed to release years of held tension. How does it feel? I asked. Terrifying. Liberating. Like jumping off something tall and not knowing if you'll fly or fall. He took a drink, considering. I spent 3 decades measuring my life in prescriptions filled and shifts completed. Clean metrics. Clear purpose, or at least purpose I could point to. Now I have time, and time is harder to measure. What if I waste it? What if I get to the end and realize I should have had a better plan? You're asking the wrong questions. It's not about having a plan. It's about being open to what emerges when you're not constantly executing someone else's plan for you. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. When did you get so wise? When I stopped waiting for permission to trust my own judgment. Took longer than it should have. My mother's watercolor class turned into a genuine passion that surprised everyone, including her. She started modestly, painting simple still lives and landscapes copied from instructional books. But something about the medium unlocked creativity that had been dormant for decades. By summer, she'd converted the spare bedroom into a studio, the space that used to hold holiday decorations and old files now filled with easels and brushes and canvases in various stages of completion. She painted the Willamette Valley in different seasons, the light changing across familiar landscapes. Painted the house on Maple Ridge Drive from angles that made it look both ordinary and somehow significant. Painted abstracts that didn't represent anything specific but captured emotion in color and movement. The work wasn't technically masterful, at least not yet, but it carried the energy of someone discovering a language they didn't know they could speak. I bought 3 of her paintings, not out of obligation but because I genuinely liked them. Hung them in my apartment where the walls had been holding expensive art I'd purchased because it seemed like what successful people did. Her work had more life in it, more honesty. When colleagues visited and asked about the paintings, I told them my mother made them, and the pride in my voice surprised me. The summer unfolded with a gentleness that felt earned. My parents visited Portland more frequently, staying in my guest room and exploring the city like tourists in a place they'd previously only driven through on the way to somewhere else. My father discovered a bookstore in the Pearl District that specialized in history and biography, spent hours browsing while my mother and I had coffee or walked along the waterfront. We had dinners where conversation flowed without the old undercurrent of tension, where difference became interesting instead of threatening. Victor noticed the change in me during one of our regular lunches, the kind of check-in we'd maintained even after the acquisition freed us from daily operational demands. "You seem settled," he observed. "Not settled like stagnant. Settled like you've made peace with something." "I think I have. With my parents, with what the last 6 years meant, with not knowing what comes next. Turns out you can hold all of it at once. The satisfaction of what you built and the uncertainty of what's ahead. The frustration with the past and the possibility of better in the future. Very zen." He grinned. "Though I notice you're still checking startup news and taking meetings with founders. Peace doesn't look like retirement for you." He was right. I'd been advising early-stage companies, offering the kind of guidance I wished someone had given me when Streamline IQ was just an idea and a pitch deck. Helping founders think through scaling challenges and team dynamics and the peculiar psychology of betting years of your life on something that statistically would probably fail. I wasn't ready to start another company yet, maybe ever, but I wasn't ready to step away from the ecosystem either. I also started speaking at events, panels about women in tech and entrepreneurship and navigating family expectations while building something risky. The first few times felt uncomfortable, imposter syndrome whispering that I'd gotten lucky and had no business offering advice. But the questions people asked after, the way young founders approached me with their own stories of parents who didn't understand or partners who wanted them to choose security, those conversations convinced me the perspective was valuable even if it felt incomplete. One woman at a startup conference in Seattle pulled me aside after a panel, her eyes bright with recognition that went beyond professional networking. "My dad's a doctor. He spent my whole childhood telling me medicine was the only legitimate path. When I told him I was leaving residency to start a company, he didn't speak to me for 2 years." She swallowed hard. "How did you deal with that? The guilt and the anger and the feeling like you were betraying everyone who'd invested in your success?" I told her the truth. "You don't deal with it all at once. You make the choice you need to make and you live with the discomfort and you build something good enough that eventually even the people who didn't believe start to see it. And if they never see it, you build a life with people who do see it, and that becomes enough." It's not a neat answer, but it's an honest one. She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "Thank you. For saying that. For being proof it's possible." The gratitude felt disproportionate to what I'd offered, but I understood the hunger behind it. When you're in the middle of disappointing people you love in order to become yourself, you need evidence that the path leads somewhere worth going. That the isolation and doubt eventually give way to something that justifies the cost. I'd needed that evidence too, and the people who'd provided it, Rachel and Victor and the early team members who'd believed when belief required imagination, they'd made the difference between persisting and giving up. Fall arrived with that particular northwest beauty, the trees turning brilliant colors against gray skies, the air carrying the smell of rain and decay and the promise of winter coming. My parents invited me to Riverside for Thanksgiving, a holiday that had historically been more stressful than celebratory in our family. But this year felt different. My father cooked, a development that surprised everyone given his previous relationship with the kitchen had been limited to coffee and sandwiches. He'd been taking classes, he explained, at the community center. Seemed like a useful skill and a creative outlet. The meal was good, not perfect but made with care, and we ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. My mother showed me her latest paintings, a series exploring memory and place, abstract enough that they invited interpretation but specific enough that I recognized elements of our family history in the shapes and colors. My father talked about the historical biography he was reading, connecting events from a century ago to current politics with the enthusiasm of someone who finally had time to think deeply about things beyond the immediate demands of work. After dinner, we sat in the living room where the Christmas tree would eventually stand, drinking wine and coffee and letting conversation meander. At some point, my father cleared his throat with the particular sound that meant he had something prepared to say. "I've been thinking about last Christmas. About how badly we misread the situation and how much damage we did by not asking questions. I know we've apologized, but I wanted to say something more specific." He set his mug down carefully. "You paid off our mortgage because you're generous and because you love us despite our failures to see you clearly. That act of grace deserved gratitude, not judgment. I'm sorry we didn't give you that. Sorry we let our assumptions override the evidence right in front of us. My mother added quietly, I'm sorry we made you feel like your success had to be hidden. Like you couldn't share good news because we'd find a way to diminish it. That's not the kind of parent I wanted to be, but it's the kind I was, and I regret that deeply. The apologies landed differently than the ones from months before, heavier with understanding, more specific in their acknowledgement. They'd been thinking about it, working through it, trying to understand not just what they'd done but why. That effort meant something, suggested the change was deeper than just surface reconciliation. I appreciate that. Both of you. And I'm sorry too, for shutting you out instead of insisting you listen. For deciding you couldn't understand instead of helping you understand. We all contributed to the distance. We sat with that, the fire crackling, the evening settling into night outside. It wasn't a Hollywood ending where everything was perfectly resolved. The hurt from years of mutual misunderstanding didn't disappear because we acknowledged it. But acknowledgement was its own kind of healing, a foundation we could build on if we kept choosing to build. The conversation turned lighter after that, my father telling a story about a customer at the pharmacy who'd tried to return a prescription because it wasn't the color she expected. My mother describing a member of her watercolor class who painted exclusively vegetables with unsettling realism. I talked about a founder I was advising who'd accidentally pitched to the wrong investor, realized halfway through, and just pivoted the entire presentation on the fly with such confidence the investor never noticed. We laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth that felt authentic. Later, lying in my childhood bed in the room that had been preserved like a museum of my adolescence, I thought about how strange and good it felt to be home in a way I hadn't been in years. Not home because nothing had changed, but home because everything had changed and we'd all changed with it. The girl who'd left this room to attend Oregon State with plans to become a pharmacist was gone. The woman who'd built a company and sold it and was now figuring out what came next, she was someone that girl couldn't have imagined but would probably be proud of. December brought an unexpected development. Marcus Vega called with news that the mortgage company had questions about last year's loan modification. Nothing serious, just an audit that wanted documentation to confirm everything had been processed correctly. Did I still have the paperwork? I met him at his office, the downtown Portland building that housed his practice along with a dozen other professional services firms. His office was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who specialized in discreet wealth management, tasteful and generic, designed to be forgettable. He pulled the file, spread documents across his desk with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. Everything's in order. The audit is routine, nothing to worry about. But it does mean the transaction will be on record more publicly than the original structure intended. Your parents will likely get documentation that makes it very clear where the money came from. I'd thought we were past this, that the revelation had already happened and been processed. Apparently there were still layers to uncover, still ways the past could resurface with new implications. Do I need to tell them this is coming? Marcus considered. Probably wise. Better they hear it from you than from an official letter that might make them feel ambushed again. I called my parents that evening, explained the situation as clearly as I could without getting too deep into financial terminology. My father listened quietly, then said, I suppose it's fitting. We spent so long not knowing the truth. Now the truth keeps insisting on being known even when we'd rather let it rest. Are you upset? I asked. No. Maybe a year ago I would have been. Would have felt like my privacy was being invaded or my pride was being wounded. But now, honestly, I'm just grateful. The documentation will show that our daughter saved our house. That's not a source of shame. That's something to be proud of. The audit resolved itself without drama, a paper trail confirming what we all already knew. But the process created another opportunity for conversation, for my parents to ask questions about wealth management and trusts and the mechanics of how money moves in ways they'd never needed to understand before. I answered what I could, suggested they talk to Marcus about setting up their own estate planning, help them think through how to leave things to the community organizations they cared about. It was intimate in a way our relationship had never been, talking about money and death and legacy. The kind of conversations that require trust and vulnerability, that assume a future where we're still connected and invested in each other's well-being. We were building something, not repairing what had broken but constructing something new from materials that included the brokenness, acknowledged it, made it part of the foundation rather than pretending it didn't exist. Winter settled in with rain and occasional snow, the Willamette Valley turning gray and dormant. I started working on a new project, not a company but a resource, a guide for founders navigating the specific challenges of building something when your family doesn't understand or support what you're doing. Collected stories from other entrepreneurs who dealt with similar dynamics. Interviewed therapists who specialized in family systems and intergenerational conflict. Tried to synthesize lessons that might help someone else avoid some of the pain I'd experienced or at least feel less alone in it. Rachel flew out from Boston in January, finally having a break from her doctoral research. We spent a weekend catching up properly, the kind of extended conversation you can only have with someone who knew you before success and stuck around after. She'd been tracking my family reconciliation from a distance, offering perspective when I needed it, celebrating progress without minimizing how hard the work was. Over coffee in my apartment, she asked the question she'd been holding. Are you happy? Not satisfied with how things worked out with your parents. Actually happy. I thought about it, looking out at the city where I'd built a life that 18-year-old me couldn't have imagined. Most of the time, yes. I'm happy with what I built, with the relationships that survived the building, with having financial security that lets me choose what's next based on what matters instead of what pays. I'm happy my parents and I found a way back to each other. But there's this weird grief mixed in with all of it. Grief for the years we lost, for the version of us that could have existed if we'd figured this out sooner. That's not weird. That's just honest. You can be grateful for where you ended up and sad about the cost of getting here. Both things can be true. She was right. The story didn't have to choose between triumph and tragedy. It could hold both, the satisfaction of success and the sorrow of relationships that had to break before they could rebuild differently. Life rarely offered clean narratives. Mostly it offered complicated ones that resisted easy categorization. My parents came to Portland in February for my 30th birthday, a milestone that felt more significant than it probably should have. We had dinner at a restaurant I'd chosen, the kind of place where the menu changed daily based on what was seasonal and local, where the chef came out to explain dishes with the passion of someone who saw food as art. My father asked questions about preparation techniques. My mother took photos of the plating to reference for her painting. We shared everything, tasted from each other's plates, lingered over dessert and coffee while the restaurant emptied around us. Before we left, my father handed me an envelope. Not a card, just a piece of paper folded carefully. Open it when you're alone, he said. It's not profound, just something I wanted you to have. Back at my apartment after dropping them at their hotel, I opened the envelope to find a letter written in my father's precise handwriting. It was 2 pages, dense with words that must have taken him time to compose. The letter began with an acknowledgement of failure. I failed you as a father in ways I'm still discovering. I taught you discipline and responsibility but not trust. I showed you how to follow a path but not how to forge one. I gave you structure but not belief. For all of that, I am profoundly sorry. He wrote about watching me grow up, seeing the ways I was different from him and feeling threatened by those differences instead of curious about them. About how his own fear of instability had made him worship security so completely that he couldn't see other forms of success as legitimate. About recognizing now that the life he'd pushed me toward would have destroyed the very things that made me capable of building what I built, the creativity and risk tolerance and willingness to fail forward that had no place in the stable path he'd envisioned. The letter ended simply. You are the bravest person I know. You were brave at 20 when you walked away from my plan for you. You were brave through 6 years of building something while your own parents failed to see you. And you were brave enough to keep the door open to us even when we gave you every reason to close it. I don't know what you'll build next, but I know it will be remarkable because you are remarkable. I'm sorry it took me 30 years to say that clearly. I love you. I'm proud of you. Thank you for refusing to become small to fit my limitations. I read it 3 times, tears blurring the words by the end. It was the validation I'd needed as a teenager and 20-year-old, arriving decades late but no less meaningful for its timing. better late than never wasn't just a cliché. Sometimes it was the best possible outcome given the limitations everyone was working with. I framed the letter and hung it in my office, not out of sentimentality but as a reminder. That people can change. That relationships can heal even after serious damage. That the story you're living might have chapters you haven't reached yet, developments you can't predict from where you're currently standing. That grace and patience and refusal to give up on connection can create possibilities that didn't exist before. The spring of my 30th year brought a clarity I hadn't anticipated. Not the kind that arrives with lightning bolt revelation, but the slower variety that emerges when you finally stop running long enough to notice what's actually around you. I'd spent my 20s in constant motion, building, improving and pushing against the resistance of people who thought they knew better. Now, with financial security established and parental reconciliation underway, I found myself in the unusual position of having space to choose what came next based purely on what pulled me forward rather than what I was running from. Rachel defended her dissertation in April, a video call I attended from my apartment while she presented to her committee in Boston. Watching her synthesize years of research into arguments about entrepreneurial ecosystems and innovation policy, I felt the peculiar pride of witnessing someone you love accomplish something they'd worked toward with single-minded focus. Afterward, drunk on relief and champagne via separate screens, she asked what I was going to do with my newfound freedom. "I'm thinking about teaching," I admitted. "Maybe adjunct work at Portland State, something in their business school. Helping students understand what actually goes into building something versus what the mythology suggests." She lit up at that, already making connections I hadn't thought through. "You should talk to Professor Williamson in their entrepreneurship program. I met her at a conference last year. She's doing interesting work around support systems for founders and would probably love to have someone with operational experience." The introduction led to coffee, which led to a conversation about designing a course that would blend theory with practical reality. Professor Williamson, who insisted I call her Karen, had spent 20 years studying entrepreneurship academically but readily admitted that classroom knowledge and operational knowledge were different species. "What students need," she said, stirring sugar into her third coffee of our meeting, "is someone who can translate between those worlds. Someone who understands the frameworks but also knows what it feels like when everything's on fire and the frameworks aren't helping." We designed the course together over several weeks, meeting in her cluttered office that smelled like old books and ambition. The curriculum would focus on the human elements of founding companies, the parts that didn't make it into most business school classes. How to have difficult conversations with co-founders when visions diverge. How to manage your own psychology through the emotional volatility of building something from nothing. How to maintain relationships outside work when work consumes every available hour. How to know when persistence is valuable and when it's just stubbornness wearing a more attractive name. The course launched in fall term with 16 students, most of them in their early 20s with ideas they believed would change the world. I recognized myself in their certainty, their energy, their conviction that they could overcome odds through sheer determination. The first class, I asked them to write down their biggest fear about starting a company. The answers were predictable and heartbreaking in their honesty. Disappointing my parents. Wasting years on something that fails. Not being taken seriously. Running out of money. Letting down people who believed in me. I collected the papers and read them aloud without names, letting the students hear their private fears reflected in their peers' anonymous confessions. Then I told them my story, not the sanitized LinkedIn version but the actual one. Sleeping on couches. Maxing out credit cards. Having my father tell me I was throwing my life away. Nearly giving up a dozen times before things started working. The day I realized we might actually make it and being too superstitious to celebrate. The complicated mix of vindication and exhaustion when success finally arrived. One student, a woman named Claire with purple-streaked hair and the intensity of someone who'd already survived things most people her age hadn't, raised her hand tentatively. "How did you deal with your family not believing in you? Like tactically, day to day, how did you keep going when the people who were supposed to support you thought you were making a terrible mistake?" The question hung in the classroom's fluorescent-lit air, 20-year-olds waiting to hear wisdom I wasn't sure I possessed. I told her the truth. Some days I dealt with it by being angry, using their doubt as fuel. Some days I dealt with it by pretending it didn't hurt when it absolutely did. Some days I called friends who did believe and borrowed their certainty when mine ran out. There's no clean answer. You just have to decide if the thing you're building matters enough to you that you're willing to build it even without their blessing. And then you have to live with that choice and all its consequences. The class became a highlight of my week, the teaching scratching an itch I hadn't known needed scratching. Helping students think through real problems they'd face, offering perspective from someone who'd recently walked the path they were starting, watching them develop from naive optimism towards something more sustainable and self-aware. Several students started companies during or right after the term. Not all of them would succeed, statistics being what they were, but they'd go into it with slightly better tools and slightly more realistic expectations about what building something actually required. My parents came to guest lecture once, a development that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Karen had suggested it after I'd mentioned their professional backgrounds, thinking students would benefit from hearing about more traditional career paths and how to navigate family dynamics when choosing non-traditional ones. I'd been skeptical but asked, and to my surprise, they'd agreed. They sat in front of 16 students and told their story with honesty I hadn't expected. My father talked about choosing pharmacy for security and stability, about the satisfaction of helping people and the slow erosion of autonomy as corporate policies increasingly dictated how he could practice. About retiring and discovering how much of his identity had been wrapped up in a job that hadn't actually reflected his values for years. My mother talked about setting aside creative pursuits to focus on practical necessities, about the resentment that builds when you ignore parts of yourself for too long, about rediscovering joy through painting in her 50s. Then they talked about me, and I had to work to keep my face neutral. We failed our daughter, my father said plainly, in ways we're still understanding. We were so afraid of instability that we couldn't see that security and meaning don't always coincide. We taught her to be responsible but not to trust herself. To follow rules but not to question whether the rules served her. When she chose a different path, we saw it as rebellion rather than self-knowledge. That was our failure, not hers. A student named Marcus asked how they'd gotten past it, his voice carrying the weight of someone dealing with similar family dynamics. What made you change your minds? My mother answered that one. We didn't change our minds so much as reality forced us to see what we'd been refusing to see. Our daughter succeeded despite our lack of support. That success was evidence we couldn't dismiss, but more importantly, we almost lost relationship with her because of our rigidity. At some point, you have to decide what matters more, being right or being connected. We chose connection. We're grateful she let us. After class, several students approached my parents with questions, their own stories of family pressure and divergent dreams. I watched my father listen with the attention he'd rarely given me at their age, watched my mother offer encouragement she hadn't known how to offer her own daughter. They were becoming the parents they'd been unable to be for me, for these strangers' children, and instead of feeling jealous, I felt something like peace. Growth doesn't erase the past, but it can redeem it through better action in the present. The teaching led to other opportunities. Guest lectures at other universities. Panels at conferences. An invitation to join an advisory board for a nonprofit supporting first-generation college students interested in entrepreneurship. Each thing led to another, building a portfolio of activities that felt meaningful without the all-consuming intensity of running a company. I was contributing without being consumed, helping without sacrificing, engaged without being overwhelmed. Victor started a new company that summer, a different space but similar approach, solving unsexy problems for unglamorous industries. He asked if I wanted to co-found again, and I spent a week seriously considering it. The pull of building something was real, the excitement of early-stage work still appealing. But ultimately I declined, recognizing that what I'd loved about Streamline IQ had been specific to that moment in my life. The hunger that had driven me through those 6 years had been fed. I didn't need to recreate the experience to prove I could do it again. Instead, I invested in his company and 3 others, taking advisory roles that let me contribute strategic thinking without operational responsibility. Helped them avoid mistakes I'd made. Connected them with people who could help. Showed up for the difficult conversations and the celebration moments. It was satisfying in a different way than founding had been, less intense but no less valuable. My parents settled into retirement with more grace than I'd expected. My father volunteered at a free clinic, providing pharmaceutical consultations for uninsured patients. The work used his expertise without the corporate constraints he'd grown to hate. He came home from shifts energized rather than depleted, stories about patients he'd helped replacing complaints about insurance authorizations and inventory management. My mother's painting evolved from hobby to serious practice, a gallery in Riverside eventually agreeing to show her work. The opening was small, mostly locals and friends, but her face when people engaged seriously with her art showed a satisfaction no paycheck had ever provided. We developed rhythms, monthly dinners that rotated between Riverside and Portland, holiday traditions that felt authentic rather than obligatory. They met my friends, integrated into my life in ways that felt natural. Victor's wife liked my mother's directness. Rachel, when she visited after taking a position at Reed College, bonded with my father over historical biography. The separation between my family of origin and my chosen family began to blur, everyone mixing at dinner parties and birthday celebrations. The second Christmas after the infamous one arrived with significantly different energy. We gathered at the Maple Ridge house again, but this time I arrived early to help with preparations rather than showing up as a guest. My mother and I cooked together, her teaching me techniques she'd learned from online videos, me introducing spices and ingredients she'd never considered. My father set the table with care that suggested the meal mattered, that the people gathering around it mattered. When we sat down to eat, he raised his glass for a toast. To second chances, he said simply. To the hard work of actually seeing the people we love. To Natalie, who refused to let our blindness become permanent. The toast was short but sufficient. We ate and talked and laughed, the conversation flowing across topics with the ease of people genuinely interested in each other's lives. At one point, my mother mentioned a painting she was struggling with, unable to capture the quality of light she wanted. I suggested she look at how certain photographers approached golden hour, showed her examples on my phone. My father talked about a patient at the free clinic whose medication regimen was dangerously complex, asked if I knew anyone in healthcare tech who might be interested in tools for medication management. Not pitching me, just trusting I might have relevant connections. After dinner, we sat in the living room with coffee and the tree lights providing soft illumination. The gifts under the tree this year were thoughtful rather than expensive, things chosen because they reflected actual knowledge of each other. A book of essays on creative practice for my mother. A first edition biography for my father. For me, a painting my mother had made, an abstract piece in blues and grays that somehow captured the feeling of Portland rain, of home as I'd come to understand it. I love it, I said, studying the canvas. It's exactly right. She smiled, pleased. I painted it thinking about you. About water and growth and persistence. About things that seem gray but contain every color if you look closely. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. We'd all learned to speak more directly, to say what we meant instead of hoping the other person would decode subtext. Clarity turned out to be a gift we could give each other, one that prevented the kind of misunderstandings that had characterized too many years. On Christmas night, after my parents had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room with the tree lights and thought about the distance traveled in 12 months. Last year at this time, I'd been driving back to Portland in tears, processing rejection and misunderstanding, wondering if relationship with my parents was even possible. Now I was sleeping in their guest room, planning breakfast for tomorrow, integrated back into family in ways that felt sustainable rather than performative. The healing hadn't been linear. We'd had setbacks, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, conversations that went sideways before we corrected course. My father still occasionally offered advice that revealed he didn't fully understand my world. My mother still sometimes worried in ways that felt like judgment. I still got defensive faster than I should, still carried scars that made me expect dismissal even when it wasn't coming. But we'd developed tools for navigating those moments, ways of calling them out and resetting without letting them derail everything. January brought news that Streamline IQ's acquisition had resulted in the product being shut down. The larger company had bought it primarily for the technology and team, integrating both into their existing platform in ways that made the original product redundant. It was expected, part of how these deals often went, but it still stung. 6 years of work reduced to building blocks in someone else's vision, the thing we'd created no longer existing in its original form. I called Victor, needing to process with someone who'd lived it. "How are you feeling about the shutdown?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sad, but also okay. We built something good. Thousands of companies used it and got value from it. The fact that it's now part of something bigger doesn't erase what it was. And honestly, I'm too busy with the new company to mourn properly. Maybe that's avoidance, or maybe it's just moving forward. I think it's both. I think most things are both." We talked for an hour, remembering moments from the early days, laughing about crises that had felt apocalyptic at the time but seemed absurd in retrospect. The conversation was its own kind of closure, acknowledging what we'd built even as it ceased to exist in recognizable form. Creation is always temporary. Companies get acquired or shut down. Even successful ones eventually become obsolete. What persists is the experience of building them, the skills developed, the relationships formed, the ways you change yourself through the process of trying to change a small corner of the world. Teaching the course again in spring term brought new students with familiar fears. I refined the curriculum based on what had worked and what hadn't, brought in guest speakers who could address topics outside my expertise. Karen and I talked about potentially developing it into a full program, a certificate or minor focused on the human elements of entrepreneurship that most business schools neglected. The administrative work required to make that happen was tedious but meaningful, building infrastructure that might help hundreds of students over years. One afternoon between classes, a student named Jordan came to office hours not with questions about coursework but with a situation. Their parents had given them an ultimatum: finish the engineering degree or lose financial support. But Jordan wanted to start a company with two friends, had a prototype and early customer interest, felt trapped between familial obligation and personal conviction. The story was so familiar it hurt. "I can't tell you what to do," I said carefully. "This isn't a decision someone else can make for you. But I can tell you that both paths have costs. Finishing the degree costs time and potentially momentum on the company. Leaving costs family relationship and financial stability. There's no option where you don't lose something. The question is which loss you can live with and which one would haunt you." Jordan nodded, eyes bright with tears they were trying to contain. "Did you ever regret it? Choosing what you chose?" "Some days, yes. Days when I was broke and exhausted and my parents wouldn't talk to me and everything felt impossible. But overall, no. I built something meaningful, became someone I'm proud of being, learned what I'm capable of when I trust myself. That doesn't mean it was the right choice universally. It was the right choice for me. You have to figure out what's right for you, and that's harder than following someone else's map." They left looking no more certain but perhaps more equipped to sit with uncertainty. I didn't know what they'd decide. Statistics suggested their company would probably fail if they pursued it, that the safe path had merit even if it felt like surrender. But statistics didn't account for the specific person making the choice, their particular talents and circumstances and tolerance for different kinds of risk. Some people needed the security of a traditional path. Others would wither under it. Knowing which kind of person you were mattered more than generic advice. My parents and I took a trip together in June, something we'd never done when I was younger. A week in the San Juan Islands, staying in a rental house near the water, spending days hiking and kayaking and reading on the deck. No agenda beyond being together, seeing if we could navigate extended time in close quarters without falling back into old dynamics. It went better than expected. We cooked elaborate meals and played board games and had actual conversations about things that mattered. My father talked about feeling adrift without professional identity, struggling to answer the question of what he did now that he didn't do anything in the conventional sense. My mother admitted that painting had revealed how much approval she still craved, how each piece felt like a test she might fail. I shared that teaching was satisfying but sometimes felt small compared to building a company, that I missed the intensity even though I didn't want to return to it. We weren't performing for each other, just being honest about the complexities of lives in transition. My father didn't offer solutions to my ambivalence about what came next. My mother didn't minimize his identity crisis. I didn't pretend their struggles were easily solved. We just listened and acknowledged and sat with each other's uncertainty without trying to fix it. One evening, watching the sunset paint the water in colors my mother immediately started planning how to capture, my father said something that stayed with me. "I spent so much of your childhood trying to teach you things. Discipline, responsibility, work ethic. I thought that's what parenting was, transferring knowledge from someone who knew to someone who didn't. But you've taught me more in the last year than I taught you in 18. About courage and resilience and the value of building something meaningful over something secure. I'm grateful for that education, even though I fought against it for so long." The acknowledgement settled something in me I hadn't realized needed settling. The dynamic had shifted, authority flowing in multiple directions rather than the single hierarchical stream I'd grown up with. We were adults relating to adults, each bringing different forms of wisdom and experience, each capable of teaching and learning. That equality felt like the foundation relationship had needed all along. Flying back to Portland after the trip, I felt a contentment that had been elusive for most of my 20s. Not happiness exactly, which seemed too simple and too fragile. More like deep okayness with where I'd landed and how I'd gotten there. The scars from family conflict hadn't disappeared, but they'd integrated into the larger story of who I was becoming. The success that had felt so urgent to prove no longer needed proving. The relationship with my parents that had required so much repair work was now just relationship, imperfect and ongoing and sufficient. Summer moved into fall, teaching began again, life developed rhythms that felt sustainable. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, still figuring out what partnership would look like with someone who hadn't witnessed the building years. Started writing more, essays about entrepreneurship and family and the complicated work of becoming yourself when becoming yourself disappoints people you love. Some of them got published, small platforms at first, then larger ones. Editors asked for more, readers reached out with their own stories, the writing becoming another way of contributing something useful to conversations that mattered. Rachel got engaged to another economist she'd met at Reed, someone who understood the peculiar intensity of academic life and didn't require her to be smaller than she was. The wedding was planned for next summer. She asked me to give a toast, and I started composing it months in advance, wanting to capture what her friendship had meant through all the years of building and doubt and eventual success. How she'd been family when family felt impossible, belief when belief was in short supply, celebration when celebration was earned. Victor's new company was gaining traction, early signs suggesting he might have another success on his hands. We had lunch monthly, comparing notes on our different paths, his building and my teaching and advising. Neither was better than the other, just different expressions of similar drives. The friendship that had survived co-founding something survived the aftermath, deepened even, no longer complicated by the power dynamics and stress of running a company together. The second anniversary of that Christmas morning arrived without fanfare. I woke in my Portland apartment, made coffee, and stood at the window watching rain pattern the glass. 2 years felt simultaneously like nothing and everything, time collapsing and expanding depending on how you measured it. By calendar days, 730 rotations of a planet around a star. By emotional distance, a lifetime of learning how to see and be seen. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. A photo of a painting in progress, morning light captured in layers of translucent color. "Thinking of you today," she'd written. "Grateful for stubborn daughters who don't give up on difficult parents." I smiled and sent back a heart. The gesture was simple but would have been impossible 2 years ago when communication between us had been surface-level pleasantries masking oceans of misunderstanding. Now we texted throughout the week, small moments of connection that built into something larger. She'd send photos of work in progress. I'd share articles I thought she'd find interesting. My father would forward historical trivia with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found space for curiosity outside professional obligation. The transformation wasn't dramatic enough for a movie montage but real enough to sustain daily life. We'd built something workable from the wreckage of what hadn't worked, and that felt like its own kind of success. Not the kind that made headlines or got celebrated publicly, just the quiet victory of relationship that continued growing instead of calcifying into resentment. I drove to Riverside that afternoon, no special plans, just Sunday dinner that had become routine. The house smelled like roasting chicken and herbs, my mother's painting supplies spread across the dining room table she'd claimed as workspace. My father sat reading in his chair by the window, the same chair he'd stood beside 2 years ago while telling me I'd disappointed him. The memory existed but no longer dominated, filed away as part of history rather than defining the present. We cooked together, the three of us navigating the kitchen with practiced ease. My father chopped vegetables with the precision he'd brought to measuring medications. My mother managed multiple dishes simultaneously with the confidence of someone who'd finally given herself permission to experiment. I set the table and poured wine and felt the ordinary comfort of family rituals that had been rebuilt through intention rather than inherited through obligation. Over dinner, my father mentioned that Mrs. Chen had asked about me again, curious what I was doing now that the company had been sold. The question came up regularly in their social circles, neighbors and friends trying to understand what my life looked like post-exit. My parents had gotten better at explaining it, could talk about teaching and advising and the various projects I'd taken on without suggesting they were placeholder activities until I got a real job. I told her you're teaching the next generation how not to make the mistakes you made, my mother said, smiling. She seemed impressed. Did you tell her about the mistakes you made? I asked gently, not as accusation but as genuine question. My father set down his fork, considering. Actually, yes. Told her we'd nearly lost you by being rigid and fearful. That we'd learned the hard way that supporting your children means trusting them even when their choices scare you. She got quiet after that. I think her son is going through something similar with his family. The conversation moved on, but I held that moment, turned it over like a stone worn smooth by water. My parents had integrated the lesson not just in relationship with me but in how they understood family dynamics generally. They'd let the experience change them in ways that extended beyond our specific situation. That suggested the healing had roots, wasn't just performance for my benefit but genuine transformation of perspective. After dinner, we sat in the living room where the Christmas tree would stand in a few weeks. The space held different memories now, layered over the old ones, both existing simultaneously. My mother showed me photos of her latest gallery showing, small but respectable, a few pieces sold to people who weren't friends doing favors. My father talked about a program at the free clinic he was helping develop, better systems for medication management for complex patients. I described a student who'd gotten funding for their startup, the pride of watching someone take lessons and apply them successfully. We were each building things, different scales and different domains but similar impulse. The need to create something meaningful, to contribute something useful, to use whatever gifts and experience we'd accumulated in service of making some small corner of the world function better. My parents had spent decades in careers that hadn't fully utilized their capabilities. Now, freed from those constraints, they were discovering what they could do when work aligned with values. I left as evening turned to night, the drive back to Portland familiar and comfortable. The highway stretched out in darkness, other cars passing with their own stories and destinations. I thought about the version of me who'd driven this route 2 years ago, crying and confused and wondering if relationship with my parents was worth continuing to pursue. I wished I could tell her it would work out, that the pain had purpose, that persistence mattered. But maybe she'd needed to not know, needed to choose connection despite uncertainty rather than because of guaranteed outcome. My apartment welcomed me back with its clean lines and city views, the life I'd built entirely on my own terms. The paintings my mother had made hung on walls alongside other art. The letter from my father sat framed in my office. Physical reminders that family could evolve, that people could grow, that stories didn't have to end where they seemed headed. I made tea and opened my laptop, pulled up the draft of an essay I'd been working on about second chances and the work they require. About how reconciliation isn't a single conversation but a series of choices made daily, repeatedly, with intention. About how you can hold both grief for what was lost and gratitude for what was found. About the specific courage required to keep showing up when showing up has historically resulted in disappointment. The words came easier now than they had when I'd started writing. I understood the story better from inside it, could see patterns and meaning that had been obscure while I was living through the acute phases. The essay wouldn't solve anyone's family dysfunction or provide a roadmap for guaranteed reconciliation. But maybe it would offer companionship to someone navigating similar terrain, proof that the work was possible even when it felt impossible. Outside, Portland glittered in the darkness, thousands of lives unfolding in their particular ways. Somewhere, someone was being kicked out by family who didn't understand them. Somewhere, someone was building something despite being told they'd fail. Somewhere, parents were realizing too late that their children had become strangers. And somewhere, maybe, families were finding their way back to each other through the hard work of actually seeing who was standing in front of them. My story was one story among millions, neither unique nor universal but mine. The humiliation had been real. The success had been real. The reconciliation was real and ongoing and imperfect. All of it true simultaneously, refusing simple narratives about triumph or tragedy. Just life, complicated and costly and occasionally beautiful when you made space for it to be. I saved the essay and closed the laptop, stood at the window one more time before bed. The city spread out below, wet streets reflecting light, the future unwritten and full of possibility. I'd spent my 20s proving I could build something despite opposition. My 30s would be about building with support, seeing what became possible when the energy spent on defense could be redirected toward creation. Different challenge, different satisfactions, the next chapter waiting to be written. 2 years ago, I'd been kicked out on Christmas morning after secretly saving my parents' house. Today, I was loved and seen and integrated back into family through mutual effort and grace. The distance between those two moments was measurable in time but immeasurable in growth. We'd all become different people, better versions shaped by necessity and choice and the willingness to try again even after failing. That felt like enough. Not everything, but enough. A foundation to build on, a story worth continuing, a family reimagined and reclaimed through the hardest and most necessary work. I went to bed grateful, not for the easy path I hadn't walked but for the difficult one that had led here, to this moment, to this hard-won piece that felt like coming home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.